Annual Torstenson Lecture in Sociology with Amy Finnegan, who I will introduce in a moment. The Torstenson Lecture Series is named after the founder of the Sociology Department, Joel Torstenson, and his legacy is very important to us. And so I'm going to ask Dr. McConnell to come up for a moment and talk about Joel Torstenson's legacy.
Let me repeat Nancy's welcome. We're so excited to see so many people here. And as Nancy pointed out, this is an event that we do every spring. We have a career night for sociology majors in the fall, and this is our big spring event with a guest lecturer and then the senior dinner afterwards. And I know it doesn't feel much like spring, but I'm just going to pretend. Yes, this is the 12th Torstenson Lecture. The department established this tradition to honor Augsburg alum Joel Torstenson, who founded the Department of Sociology in 1947. At the same time that he was creating our sociology department, he also worked to found the Department of Social Work. And 2 decades later, in the mid-1960s, Joel authored a white paper entitled, quote, "The Liberal Arts College in the Modern Metropolis," which is considered a seminal document for shaping Augsburg College and Augsburg University's urban mission, and for making the case for the creation of the Metro Urban Studies program. As a response to the assassination of Martin Luther King, which we acknowledged 50 years ago this week, Joel Torstenson and several colleagues founded an initiative called the Crisis Colony, which later became the Metro Urban Studies program, which was the first academic program of HECUA, which is the Higher Education Consortium for Urban Affairs, which some of you students may be familiar with. He also helped to found that HECUA program. Additionally, he created the Scandinavian Urban Studies term, or SUST, which was another original program within HECUA. Off campus and on, Professor Torstenson and his equally important partner and wife, Fran, who is now 104, and was able to join us for the dedication of the Torstenson space in the Hagford Center, which I encourage you all to look at. They both together had a profound impact on the college come university, having served it and our department with integrity and passion for many decades. Tonight's event is an opportunity for our department and for all of us to honor the legacy of Joel Torstenson.
All right, I would like to give you a little background on our speaker, Amy Finnegan. Amy is a sociologist from the University of St. Thomas across the river, where she is the department chair of Justice and Peace Studies. She is also co-director of SocMed, which is a social justice organization seeking to expand the conversation and engagement with the social determinants of health through education and movement building. She received her Ph.D. from Boston College in sociology, where she wrote Beyond Victimhood, Narratives of Social Change from and for Northern Uganda. She teaches on different subjects such as peace and conflict, social justice and change, human rights, social movements, globalization, and health policy. And she has written articles on social medicine, U.S. activism towards Africa, and she wrote an earlier piece in Context magazine, which I think some of you see. It's the sociology magazine called The White Girl's Burden. So we look forward today to hearing her talk, The White Girl's Burden, American Altruism Towards Africa. Let's join me all in welcoming Amy.
Good evening. I'm really grateful to be here. Thanks for inviting me. Thanks for spending this hour together. I am going to talk a little bit about my project, my research project, which is actually ongoing. This was a dissertation project, and it did result in that publication in Context. But it's also it's entered a new iteration. So I'll speak a little bit to that. I'm hoping to kind of just raise some questions that I think about when I think about this sociological project, and engage you to help me think about that, maybe especially when we get into the Q&A. So I'm going to start with 4 questions that I think these aren't my research questions, but these are questions that I still sort of wrestle with. And as a sociologist, as an educator, as somebody engaged in social justice activism, these are questions that I think are important. So the first one is, how do we create an advocacy message simple enough to mobilize, but complex enough to not obfuscate the real challenges that need to be addressed? So how do we navigate this tension between simplicity that's necessary for mobilization, but also complexity to really understand like the sociological roots and causes of the social problems that we care about? The second is, as outsiders, how do we navigate the tension of our personal quest for efficacy with the principles of humility and partnership? And this is a question that I face a lot myself. As I think about, I want to be useful in society, but how can I do that with also engaging these values, these principles that I've come to really appreciate around humility and partnership? The third, in advocacy and social justice work, what are the structures of accountability? Who's responsible when impact does not match intent? So as I'll talk a little bit today, I spent a lot of time with a lot of people with really good intentions, but that didn't necessarily result in the kind of impact that they were hoping for. And so where does accountability lie when that's the case? And then the fourth is, how can people with privilege engage thoughtfully in meaningful social justice efforts with those who disproportionately experience oppression? So what does it mean for privileged people with privilege, which can be race, class, gender, sexual orientation, all sorts of kinds of privilege that we think about in an intersectional lens? How do those with privilege, how can they engage in social justice with others who have less power in society? Like, how can they do that thoughtfully? How can I do that thoughtfully? So those are the questions that I continue to kind of hang on to, and I think are sort of at the core of this project. And I invite you to help me think them through as well. So when I graduated from college, I went to WashU. When I graduated from college, I was curious, young person, I want to see the world. And so I ended up in a volunteer program in East Africa, in Uganda, and had a really transformative experience this first year after college. I worked in high school, did some after school programs, and did a public health project. And that sort of began what is now an 18-year relationship with communities and work that's involved in Uganda. I learned a lot about around the value of long-term relationships and sort of really trying to build to learn from building relationships with people over time. And so after that first year, I came back and I moved to Boston, and I worked in public health, and then I went to grad school, and I kept looking for opportunities to go back to Uganda for short periods of time, for long periods of time, and sort of try to keep those relationships up. Eventually, I learned of this group called Invisible Children in the year 2005. How many of you have heard of Invisible Children? Just a few now. If I would have said this maybe I gave this lecture 5 years ago, I wonder if any more hands would have been up. But they are a group which I'll talk about. They're a big kind of focus of my research. They put out a film their first film in 2005, and it documented this story of kids that were affected by the LRA war, the Lord's Resistance Army War, which was taking place in northern Uganda. So this is a map of Uganda. Oops.
Sorry, smart board.
Oh, no worries. So there we got Uganda there, East Africa. This is Uganda as a country. Northern Uganda, and Gulu, where I had started to do work, was right over there. It's because I'm touching it?
Yeah, smart board, sorry.
Smart board, that's what
I should have told you, sorry.
No worries, I'll stand clear. So this film comes out, and it's about these kids who are affected by war. And it was put together by 3 young white guys from Southern California. And they put together this film, and this was 2005, so this was 5 years after I had first started going to Uganda, first started building relationships with people. And had learned a ton, had learned a lot about the history and the politics from Ugandan mentors and Ugandan friends. And so I remember seeing this film and experiencing a lot of dissonance between my experience having been there and from what I had learned about the war in particular, and the narratives that were being told in the film. And the film was geared towards young Americans, high school, college aged, like that was their target audience. And so I wrestled with that. And essentially it led to this research project, which is qualitative, ethnographic, spending time with people in their own space and time, interviews, time in Uganda, and time in United States. So I started by doing an ethnography of invisible children, so spending time with these young people that had put together this film, and then they mobilized this whole crew of people, which they called roadies, that went out to different schools, colleges, youth groups, and showed these films. So I spent time with them and interviewed them. And then I went to Uganda again, spent a year there, or a better part of a year, doing an ethnography with activist groups in northern Uganda. So in the region where the stories that invisible children were telling were coming from. And then did interviews and focus groups there as well. And by the way, if people have questions along the way, feel free to raise your hands. I like that kind of education. And then now, which I'll talk about at the end here, is I have a new set of interviews where I've gone back and talked to some of those same young people who are now in their mid-20s for the most part, have more life experience, to kind of have them reflect on what that earlier activism meant for them and what kind of impact it had on their life. So that's kind of like the methodology that I have been using in this project. So broadly, I'm sort of examining insider and outsider activist efforts that seek to address this LRA war, the Lord's Resistance Army War, which has taken place in northern Uganda. And I won't get into the history of that. It's a complicated war, which is not really active in northern Uganda anymore. The LRA is an insurgency group that has now unfolded into the Central African Republic. There's been a dramatic humanitarian crisis in northern Uganda as a result of that, in parts of southern Sudan, Democratic Republic of Congo, and Central African Republic. The Lord's Resistance, during the time of the war in northern Uganda, people were placed in internally displaced people's camps, which are like refugee camps, divorced of their livelihoods, difficult access to education, to healthcare, transportation, a lot of human rights violations by both the LRA and the Ugandan military that was sort of occupying the space. So my focus, and which I'll focus on today, is really focusing on the invisible children, like the American activists, but the broader project has looked at both the activists from Uganda and the activists from the United States that were both trying to address this war and the ways that people were affected by human rights violations. And the last thing I'll say is like my other part of my approach is I see myself very much as an activist scholar. So I study activism, I study social movements because I'm interested in thinking about how we can carry out more sustainable social justice work. I am especially interested in thinking about how folks with privilege can be good allies or good comrades in struggles for social justice, which is interesting. This is a pretty embarrassing photo of me in that very first year that I was in Uganda. And so as I went to grad school, I developed this Afrocentric critique, post-colonial critique of what I saw happening with invisible children. And I remember I had this really kind of critical perspective of what they were doing. And I remember going to one of my mentors in Uganda at the beginning of my sort of longer dissertation period there. And this mentor at University said to me, I kind of told him like what I'm going to do. I'm going to bring together the insiders and the outsiders, and I'm going to critique the outsiders. And he was like, but who are you? But who is Amy? And it was a really good reminder that I needed to kind of put my own positionality as a white American with privilege who was coming to analyze this situation in Uganda and the United States. But I needed to put myself into the project because I occupied a space that was particularly important when thinking about insiders and outsiders. I'm certainly not an insider to northern Uganda. But by the time I really got into the dissertation research, I had 10 years of relationships built there. I also wasn't a total outsider because of those relationships and because of some of the nuanced learning I had done from mentors there about what the war really looked like. And so I really put myself into my project. Like, I reflect on my own positionality. Like, I take a participatory action research approach, and I think about what is my space, like what is my role in this? And I used it as well because when I talk to people, both Ugandans but especially young Americans, when I'm doing the research, they're often curious, like, well, what do you think? Because you've been to Uganda. What do you think about what we're doing? And rather than sort of taking a more like objective, I'm just going to look at the situation from the outside, I really named my position and said, well, it wasn't the first thing I offered up, but I did use my previous experience as a way to begin further dialogue with them, like in our ethnography and interviews. Does that make sense? All right. So I'll give you a quick flavor of this first film they put out that went, got a lot of attention. It's really kind of led to, it's like a minute long, this video. Oops, oh, shoot, sorry, just skipped to the end. So Invisible Children, I'll give you a little context about them. They were started in 2003. 3 young white guys go to northern Uganda, and they come across, as they describe, this humanitarian crisis and these kids that are affected by the war. And that's what some of those images are. Kids who are fearing abduction, kids who are night commuters, meaning that it's not safe for them to stay at their homes at night, and they commute into bus parks, which is like that big scene at the end. They have to sleep there for safety. And they make a film about it. And then they come back to the United States and they finish the film and they start showing it and distributing it to their friends and family. And they get this reaction. The story that they tell is they get this big reaction that are like, well, you gotta do something with this. You gotta raise money. And so they create a nonprofit, and then they create this organizing strategy where they get young people, mostly high school and college age kids, to commit to 3 to 4 months of their time, where they call them roadies, and they're in groups of 4, and they travel the country. They take a region of the country and show the film to these clubs, and then afterwards, people are emotionally drawn into the horror of the war and the situation of these kids affected by violence, and they're like, what can I do? You can give money. And so then they raise money, and they raise like millions of dollars. Their budget becomes an annual budget of around $8 million, and it's grassroots money. I mean, it's like $25. It's not big grants from USAID or something. It's young people putting out money, and then they keep making these films. So they make about 12 of these films, and each year they do a different film, and they do a different kind of roadie tour, they call it. They were on Oprah Winfrey a couple of times, which 15 million viewers. They started getting involved with an advocacy organization, and they got young people to show up to Washington, D.C. for these lobby days, and they played a big role in passing the Lord's Resistance Army Disarmament and Northern Uganda Recovery Act, which was a bipartisan piece of legislation that mandated the Obama administration to develop a strategy to address the LRA, which eventually led to 100 U.S. military advisors being deployed to the region, as well as some funds for Northern Uganda transitional justice and recovery efforts. And then in 2012, they had this huge campaign called Coney 2012. Was likely, has been quoted as the most successful NGO social media campaign in history. They had 100 million views within a week. And it got tweeted out by all these famous celebrities. And they raised $12 million. It was like crazy, like all this attention very quickly, like an example of something going quote unquote viral. And so it was this is a little bit of the history of who they are. I spent some time then trying to understand like what motivates these young people, and what's part of their story or their narrative. The other thing I want to say before I kind of unpack that a little bit is I think there's two other pieces of context that are important. One is just kind of like the broader social, political, cultural orientation that America has towards Africa. And these are just a lot of images from popular culture that sort of lift up, that highlight Africa, but it's really a narrative of like, we Americans are gonna save Africa from herself, because no one else has the capacity to do this. So if we don't do something, no one will. This is part of like this narrative that really gets perpetuated with a lot of this celebrity activism towards Africa, in Hollywood and films, and I think the backdrop, like the rise of invisible children, really happened in this kind of cultural moment where it was exotic and important and heroic even to be doing work on behalf of Africa. And then the other piece is I use a lot of social movement sociology literature, but also post-colonial studies, like thinking about Edward Said's work and looking at how the West looks at the East. And similarly, I think my work is really kind of showing that like there's this process of like the media that's portrayed about Africa. It really ends up saying a lot more about the West, or about invisible children, or about us, if you want to put yourself in that category, than it does about the actual reality on the ground. So that's sort of the parallel there. I just brought in that theoretical background since we're at an academic sociological lecture here. So, as I was saying, I'm experiencing dissonance, right? So this is this group of young Americans that are at a particular event in Boston called The Rescue in 2009. And then this is a group of activists. So these are like, they would call themselves invisible children activists. And then on the left are activists from Northern Uganda who work on peace and human rights issues. So what I want to kind of unpack a little bit is like what I sort of saw happening, especially with this group. Oh, I just did it again. Okay. So, first of all, we have, and I think I want to put this out there because I think it essentially describes the kind of activism that they were lifting up. And then there are consequences for this, which is where I want to go with like all those questions I was asking. So first, you have a group of American youth who are very privileged. When I spoke with Jason Russell, who is one of the founders of Invisible Children, when I had the opportunity to interview him, he said that this is his quote, the majority of them, those comprising the US movement, are young, I would say 14 to 15 to 23 to 24-year-old girls who are white, who have been raised in suburbia, who are Christian, who have enough disposable income to donate or buy stuff. That's our core. He told me that when they're making films, they're imagining their target audience to be a 14-year-old high school freshman girl who, quote, would have never thought of being part of something like this. Well, this is like a pretty unusual demographic to draw, change agents from. It's sensible in this case because part of what they're funneling people towards is fundraising. And so the idea that this group of people have income and have resources to give makes sense. As Doug McAdam this sociologist wrote this book about Freedom Summer, he talked about people being biographically available. And so in many ways, these young people were biographically available to this activism. So they're predominantly upper middle class, white, female, adolescents, many who attend private colleges and high schools. So that's like the group that would just kind of, those characteristics would characterize many of who these folks were. And they learn, so essentially they learn about this terrible war happening in northern Uganda. And it results in the suffering of Ugandans, of children in particular. That's like a big part of the films that come out. And they're living in privilege, many of them are conscious of it, they learn about this situation, and then they feel an urgency to do something. They hear about these stories, and they're like, this isn't okay, I need to do something. I have enough, and other people should have this too, is something that, like a comment that one of my participants said. This is another quote. This is a young student who actually took time off from college to become a roadie for Invisible Children. As in, what compelled me to be here? Because I left college. I had school and I had everything. And like I had a roommate and this awesome roommate, and I had a meal plan where I could have unlimited food. I just had everything in the world, and I hated it because I felt selfish. And I felt like there was something going on in the world that I knew about, and that I knew I had an opportunity to do something. And how could I possibly turn that down and turn these kids down and let them be disappointed? So we have young privileged people learning about a situation in another part of the world that is atrocious, feeling this urgency to do something. And the next piece of it is, I think, as they feel this urgency to do something, they also yearn for recognition and for a sense that what they're doing is unique and special. And I think part of what they get from becoming activists on this issue is this is not an issue that at the time was really circulating in American media or in American schools, and so they sort of become like the experts. And they get this sense, this kind of inflated sense of their importance, because they're talking about this issue that no one else is talking about. Several of them spoke to that. I think the initial thing for me was like, how does no one know about this? It's going on for so long, and how does no one know about this? And there's several examples of students reflecting on this. So together we have privileged young Americans learning about this terrible war, feeling an urgency to do something, wanting to feel wanting to feel special or unique or kind of recognized in their efforts. And it produces this really unique form of activism, which one of my participants actually named. He called it non-wave-making activism. And so this was someone who's a little bit older, but who was working for Invisible Children. And he said, when I grew up, like if you use the word activist when I was in high school or college, and in my mind I immediately thought, yes, someone who's going to a WTO protest, someone who is learning anti-policing strategies and ways to get around tear gas in such a way that it doesn't affect you. And so what's interesting is that this group, Invisible Children, is the total opposite. I mean, they're not only non-violent, but they are like non-wave making. They don't want to make ripples. They want to operate within the system to get as much done as possible instead of flipping the system on its head. And so a big part then of what the activism looks like is it's raising money. So it's fundraising. It's fundraising, and it eventually also is some policy work or advocacy work, but it is supporting the US government and the US military. So very state-centric policies that they are endorsing. So this is kind of what this ends up looking like. This is a picture from one of the demonstrations they did. They used to do these big demonstrations like for 4 years in a row. They did one every year, and they kind of embodied the experience, some kind of experience from the children go through in northern Uganda. And so this was called The Rescue, and this took place in the Boston Common in 2009. And the students were marched from different parts of town with like their arms tethered to each other in a rope, which is like an experience of kids who've been abducted by the LRA. They had to move in this kind of way. And then they were supposed to go to this LRA camp where they waited to be rescued by a celebrity. And I think in Boston that year it was someone from Senator Kerry's office and somebody from the Red Sox who came later that evening to sort of recognize their activism, I suppose, and make a statement. And so this happened around the country. It was called The Rescue. And they did several kinds of, where they tried to embody some dimension of life in northern Uganda through their demonstrations. So the other piece, I'm not going to talk about it as much as this is just one of the groups that I followed in northern Uganda called Human Rights Focus. And I think the piece I want to say about the Ugandan activism is that it's vibrant, and there were many diverse forms of strategy, diverse strategies and tactics that folks were using. As I said, when I first, I had relationships with many of these groups before I started my research with them, but I went to them, after kind of developing a pretty big critique of invisible children, and I kind of went to many folks in northern Uganda expecting them to be like super critical as well, and expecting them to be like lambasting these Americans for trying to save them, and it was, so I went sort of looking for a big kind of pushback, and I did not find that. I found that they were surprisingly not alarmed by by all this invisible children media carried out on their behalf. And I think it's not because they didn't see any problems with it, because when I asked questions around what, I'd show the films and be like, what do you think about this? Like, people had critiques and they had concerns, but I think largely the work of invisible children didn't touch their lives all that much. Like, it was actually quite peripheral to the activism that they were carrying out in the region. So in many ways, the invisible children folks had a much larger sense of themselves and of their impact than people that were most directly experiencing the problem. Like I said, they did have critiques, and they also had a lot of appreciation. The appreciation they had was for the money, because Invisible Children was developing some programs that was supporting education infrastructure, rebuilding schools that had been affected by the war in northern Uganda, and many folks did appreciate that. As much as they might be like, this media is like a little off, the narrative here isn't exactly true in terms of like the complexity of the war and in the ways the Americans portrayed themselves, they also were like, well, this is money that's useful. Like, kids are going to high school and university that hadn't been able to otherwise. So I appreciate some of what Invisible Children is doing. All right, so, oh yes, I'm going to talk about what I'm doing today, but I don't think I'm talking about that yet. So, what are the implications? Like, what does this all mean that this is playing out? I think why it's important to think about this, there's a couple of things, and why it's concerning to me. First, I think there's a lack of, by the Americans, there is often a lack of consciousness of social change agents, of activists from the regions, like from northern Uganda. So it was a sense, the narrative was like, I need to do something because no one else will. And there was no looking at like, what's already happening? What's already happening by the people that are most affected and know the situation really well. And so I think that's a big concern that I can see replicated in other situations where people who are well-intentioned, who have, I do think that a lot of these people had they wanted to do something meaningful with their lives. They recognized they had privilege. They said, hey, I just learned about this terrible war happening. I need to do something. But they weren't able to translate that into working with others. Instead it was more about this is my project. And they didn't even go looking. They didn't start by looking for what's already happening. What kind of activism might be happening. Part of that, I would argue, is partly because the narratives we get about Africa and all the movies and the celebrity stuff is that there isn't anything happening. There's just victims and perpetrators. There's not activists. There's not practitioners, people who are working for change there. Another kind of consequence is policy that arguably was misinformed. The policy that Invisible Children played a tremendous role in getting through, which is exciting. It's exciting for young people to get a bipartisan piece of African policy through the US Congress. But that policy essentially gave more military assistance to the region. And my experience working with peace groups there is that's the last thing that was needed, was more bolster to the military. And there's a lot of concern of how that military aid would actually be, what the impacts would be. And then ultimately, I think it also kind of leads to a continued sense that young Americans have of shaping their orientation towards Africa and towards social justice work in general, where it becomes more more of a orientation of paternalism. I need to help and save and fix this other problem that's not mine. Versus one of mutuality and working with people, a more collaborative approach. So the work I'm doing now, which was still unfolding, is going back and talking to these young folks, invisible children, folks who are now older and wiser and doing interesting things. They are, I would say in general, and part of the reason this came up was because one of them, who was super, super into invisible children when I first met him in 2009, randomly wrote me an email, and he was a grad student at Harvard, and he said, I looked up something that you wrote, and I was thinking about your research, which as a researcher, all of us who've done research, it's the biggest compliment ever. You were thinking about something I wrote or said. And he said, I want you to know that I changed, and I think about what I was part of earlier in my life differently. And I think it played an important role for me, but I also have a big critique. And I feel somewhat even angry about some of the narratives that I was perpetuating. So his seed sort of planted this interest I had in talking to more folks. A lot of them talk about how invisible children open their eyes. There was this theme again of this an outsized notion of what your impact is, and a need for self-congratulations. Certainly many of the people, I would say in general, there's a move towards more criticism and certainly a pull away from invisible children. Very few of them are still somehow connected, and the organization has changed dramatically anyways. I wouldn't say the majority of them call themselves activists or social justice folks necessarily now, but many of them are engaged in different issues. So they talk about invisible children providing a sense of purpose to young Americans who wanted to do something. They make people, invisible children has this real strong narrative, you can make a difference and you can make the impossible possible. You can stop a war. But I think we need to think about, but who is the you? Who are they speaking to? And is the empowerment of young Americans essentially at the expense of others? Is it still, and also I think the other big concern is it's still an individual frame. You are doing it to relieve some guilt you have about your privilege, rather than actual meaningful, long-term social justice work that's going to require a lot of dialogue and a lot of back and forth and a lot of messiness. So, so that's a little bit where we are. I think that it's easy to critique invisible children. I'll be curious what some of your all's reactions are. I think it's easy to critique and sort of naysay and like find all the problems with what they do, or what they have done. I also think paralysis is not acceptable. And so I think that after Coney 2012 came, there was a big flurry of people pushing back on invisible children. Both American academics and also Ugandans as well were speaking out and saying, who are these people? This is a crazy movie. How dare they think they can save us? And I think those is an important critique, but we can't stop there. We can't just be naysayers. Partly because I don't think that's what's going to lead to real social justice or real social change. I think my own experience is that partnership is possible, and like a different form of partnership that's less paternalistic, less I'm coming here to be your partner and save you and help you, and where I'm going to stay up and you're going to stay down. I think we can move from paternalism to one more of peers, where we can sort of like enter a space of more mutuality, more reciprocity. And it's part of the reason I believe it is because I've seen it. And I've partly seen it through some work I've done with this organization called SocMed, which I think I'll probably stop because I think we're supposed to go to Q&A, but I can talk more about this in the Q&A. And this is just an effort to study social determinants of health with people from outside of Uganda and people inside of Uganda together. So yeah, I think that's probably where I'll leave it. I'll just remind us of those questions I put out at the beginning as well, because I think those are the questions that I still wrestle with, and I'm still kind of guided by thinking, how do we do good social justice, comradeship well and thoughtfully? So thank you.
All right, we have about 15 minutes for questions. What questions do you have? Or comments?
Yeah, our comments are welcome. Yeah.
So at the end you were saying that people who participated with the invisible children were not as quick to call themselves activists.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering if this kind of influenced that, or why you think that is, or if you ask them about why they don't refer to themselves as activists anymore. I find that interesting.
Yeah, I think it's kind of a hard, when I'm reflecting on this and working through this now, part of it is we all have different definitions of what it means to be an activist. So it's not a totally clear, a clarified term, but I think many of them hold activism up as something to be lauded, and it requires a certain amount of grit or strength or passion that I think they're hesitant to really claim that. And you're asking why were they earlier and why are they not so much now? That's a good question. That's a really good question.
Maybe you don't know, but I'm just
Yeah.
find that interesting.
Yeah. I guess I don't know. I think I'm not sure. I think that a lot of them have gotten into jobs where they feel the grind of American life, and they aren't just putting in as much time towards what they would consider activism. Some of them do work that is still connected to social change efforts. But yeah, I'm not totally sure. It's a good question. Yeah?
So you mentioned that you chose Invisible Children, and then there was the other one, Human Rights Group?
Yeah, there was a couple of different groups in Uganda.
Okay, how did you make consensus of which one you wanted to focus on and since critique and study at the time instead of Invisible Children? What led you to that?
So my critique, so
In the selection process, how did you decide on Invisible Children as opposed to other groups?
yeah, okay, so Invisible Children is just the dominant American campaign that was focusing on northern Uganda. So I knew I wanted to do something in northern Uganda because I had a lot of relationships there, and I felt like that was really important to moving forward with qualitative research. And so Invisible Children was the group that was really kind of carrying out this phenomenon with all this films and videos, etc. And so they like Save Darfur is a similar kind of, I don't know if you're familiar with them. They had a lot of actually national attention, but they didn't have the kind of media young people dimension that I think Invisible Children did. questions. Yeah, does that answer your question? For Uganda, I looked at 3 different groups. But I think particularly because maybe I'm based in the US, I work with American students, I'm an American, I felt like I wanted to put my axis of critique on the folks that were coming from my region.
I actually would like to know more about SocMed.
Oh,
Since
cool.
you've seen the alternative of how it fits in a paternalistic way, you kind of indicated that you think this is working better, so tell us more about that, please.
Yeah, totally. Thank you for asking. Yeah, so basically SocMed is a social justice group that is focused on social determinants of health, education, and advocacy, trying to help folks, mostly like, originally it was students who are health professional students, it was medical students, to help them expand their understanding of health, to think about the social determinants, so things going on in society, and how that was really important and has a huge role in actual health outcomes. And so what we have done is create courses in Uganda, and now we work with partners in Haiti, and now we have here in Minnesota too. And in the Ugandan and Haiti models, half the students are university students from that region, and then half are students from outside. And it's a class really based in like Freudian education, very experiential, a lot of group work, a lot of dialogue, and then a lot of discussions around axes of power and privilege, but with a really diverse classroom, because folks are coming from all over. And students do like an advocacy project in the class, and I see like the power of relationships unfolding where people see each other as friends, and young Americans coming in with a sense of, I guess, vulnerability and humility that I think is really appropriate for work in global health in Uganda or in Haiti. And so, yeah, that's the sense of the sense of it. Our 3 axes we talk about are praxis, which is taking from Freire, like this idea, this iteration between reflection and action, getting personal, and so we don't just like talk about structural violence, like, oh, that's a terrible thing happening out there, but recognizing how we experience structural violence. Some of us benefit from it, some of us are hurt by it or harmed by it, and then with this goal of moving towards partnership through various activities in the class. And so I lift it up as an example because I think it's like when I was saying before, I feel like we can get really, really critical and move into the state of like, wow, we may as well not do anything if I can't, if these well-intentioned Americans made videos about war in Uganda and now you're going to say terrible things about them. And I think, no, let's not stop it. Let's not stop with the critique, like let's try. And I think it's possible. I think it's possible to have partnership. I think it's possible for people from the United States to talk thoughtfully and humbly to people from Uganda and strategize about how we might tackle problems. I mean, that seems super obvious, but in practice, it doesn't happen a lot, especially in the field of global health. There's a lot of flashy talk about partnership, but the actual gritty reality of recognizing that we don't all start in the same space is not always happening, and I think it's challenging, but I think it's possible, and I've seen it happen. So, yeah.
Can you describe more about partnership, because it's really interesting to see, like, how can the people from the United States tackle their privilege and be in a partnership with Uganda, because the whole history of colonization and militarization of the police, like, wouldn't that be perpetuating the current, like, white women's burden on Uganda by, like, having those dynamics of power?
By being in partnership in general.
Yeah, I'm just like interested to see how that works.
Yeah. Well, I think it's not a straightforward process.
Yeah.
But I guess what I'm trying to say is I think it's possible. And so I don't think the answer is for white people to not do anything with poor people in Uganda, for example. Because I don't think that undoes any of those issues that you just brought up, militarization, et cetera, racism. So you're asking, how does it actually happen?
Yes.
Yes. So I think it starts by people of privilege acknowledging their privilege, recognizing the power that they have, being thoughtful about that, being asked to interrogate that, also being asked to reflect on their national origins and like the history of US imperialism in Africa, like coming in with that historical background, I think is really important. It's also not necessarily something that all of like our Ugandan students have that experience either, of really like thoughtful, and they all have lots of education on colonialism, but like the role of American imperialism, that's not necessarily part of their like education either. So I think including that in the class discussions, being honest about, I guess providing that framework so people have that understanding of how the structures have led us to where we are today. And then, I just find that people wanna get to, people are thirsty to make connection. And I think that we can be honest about all those levels of power and privilege, and people still can make some meaningful friendships. And so I don't actually know how it happens. I think part of it is like the magic of human synergy. When we also can come into a space where we're entering it humbly and with like a stance of curiosity. Does that make sense? I don't know if you had something else you wanted to.
I was thinking like more structurally, but I guess like that makes sense if you take it like more individual standpoint.
Yeah, what do you mean by more structurally, or what are you thinking about? Do you have an idea about how to do it or not do it, or?
I'd rather have like this discussion, like I'll just ask you one-on-one.
Oh yeah, sure, okay, cool. Great. Yeah.
So going back on one of your questions you presented about who is responsible of where the vision it's misaligned. In your perception after having experienced, and if this is something you're still kind of struggling with, without having to like point fingers, but like how do you process that at where you're at then? How do you find out who is responsible for this misalignment, or I think that was kind of the gist of your question.
As far as
accountability, essentially, yeah.
You want me to answer this question?
Well, if you don't mind, like, sharing a little bit of where you are right now with that.
Yeah. I think where I am, so I think that it needs, structures of accountability often aren't there, which is what is an unfortunate reality, I think. And so people with power can say they have good intentions and do harmful things, and then nothing really happens, right? So I guess we have, those of us who see that as a problem need to name it and call each other out, call ourselves out. I think I as an educator, I put a lot of energy on trying to foster a sense of responsibility for we have to go beyond intent, right? And recognizing obviously the difference between intent and impact, but you don't get a pass because you had good intentions, right? And so if something that you intended to do well didn't turn out well, what are you gonna do to stay engaged and be honest about that, and then try to change it, I guess. Does that make sense? So I think the question is who is responsible when impact does not match intent? I would say the person who had the intent, the original intent. I think we have to, those of us who care about this have to name that. Yeah.
So is this organization still operating today?
Invisible Children?
Yeah.
They are. They don't have programs in northern Uganda any longer.
Okay.
Because the war has really shifted out of there anyhow. They don't do advocacy in the United States either. They mostly have some fundraising efforts to do some work in Central African Republic, in the Democratic Republic of Congo, where where the LRA is dwindling but still active.
So my question, if they've morphed, is less relevant, but the rescue thing, just like being just exposed to this really interesting thing, it kind of creeps me out, you know, that thing. And so, I mean, you're of course right about power and privilege, but there's something about targeting white 14-year-old girls that is odd to me, right? Because yes, they have suburban money and stuff, but that's a group that's pretty easily manipulated.
Yeah.
And so, I mean, I appreciate that it's a little different from what you were looking at because it's a question about the organization. But could you say a little bit more about that way in which they were trying to get these young women to get their parents to give them the money to, I don't know, if you could just say a little bit more about that, because that, I see the privilege, but it also seems like there's a vulnerability or a manipulation possibly there.
Yeah, I think, well, I definitely think there was like a gender dynamic, especially in Invisible Children, the three young people who did, at least in the beginning, that really kind of guided it and did a lot of the films were these young kind of men who put on this kind of attractive, like exotic motif that I think there was a very interesting dynamic with who they were actually mobilizing, being young girls. Yeah, I think the gender piece is huge. I think that it's focused on women, but women, white women with privilege. I'm not sure if I'm totally getting, just to say more about how they.
Well, just, was that just as it appeared to be, you know, from the organizational perspective, or was there a kind of manipulation by the organization of a group that might be easily manipulated?
I guess I didn't feel like there was a manipulation.
Okay.
I'm not to say that there wasn't. I think one of the main movement directors was a woman who, I think, in interviewing her and having conversations with her, I think she was sensitive to some of these dynamics. I don't know. I think I don't know if I think there was manipulation, but I think it's an interesting thing to think about, like how that could be part of it. Yeah.
Thanks.
We've got 2 minutes left. Is there one last question you'd like to get in? All right, well, let's
Okay.
Oh, you have one more,
Okay.
last one. Sorry about
Hi,
that.
thanks for your presentation. I wanted to know the process of the title of your research, The White Girl in Burden.
Yeah, well, I think it's describing the predominant demographic of invisible children, so white girls, and kind of taking from Kipling's idea, like the white man's burden, this sort of problematic narrative that's really tied to colonialism of white people, Europeans, Americans, being engaged in a process where they think they are helping Africans, but they are actually like carrying out an ideology that is seeing themselves as better and superior to others. So I was trying to play on that idea, because I think that while these white girls think that they are maybe doing something that is quote unquote helpful, they are also part of a broader project that is damaging or hurtful or racist, colonialist. Does that make sense?
Yeah, so if you could go back, would you change it into a different title? Because if you had like no context of your research and you're just seeing your research on a screen and it's like White Girl's Burden, either it's a marketing tool for people to like lure into your research or step back and not look at it at all because of the narrative of what your title says. So would you change it or would you keep it? And if you would change it, what would it be?
So, good question. So are you saying that when you read White Girl's Burden, you're like, I don't want to go to that? That sounds...
Well, one of my friends, she's not a sociology major, but she's just like, well, what is she trying to like prove or what is she trying to say? Because it's already like a negative connotation, like what could you be like burdening about?
Yeah.
So that's why I asked, like, if
Yeah.
you would change it to something different. What would you...
That's that's a good question. I hadn't thought of that. I think, but it's a good point that maybe that's not clear. I think it's, to me, when I read that, it's a play on the white man's burden, which comes with a big, from my perspective, a big critique. But that doesn't sound like that's necessarily how other people read that. So that's, thank you.
Any other questions?
All right, let's thank Amy